Hey guys, tonight we journey somewhere dark, a little smelly, and definitely dangerous. You're stepping straight into the cobble filth of a medieval village, the sun barely cutting through with smoke and mildew. Your stomach growls, loud, embarrassing, desperate. You're hungry, and food must be just around the corner, right? You spot a bakery. The warm scent of crusty loaves drawing you in like a moth. But the moment you bite into that bread, crack. That's not a walnut. That's a pebble. Or sand. Or something worse. Welcome to dinner, where the flour's been stretched with ground-up rocks to cheat the scales, and where even bread wants your teeth gone by 30. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through that village with your jaw sore and spirit already wilting. The smell of cabbage hangs in the air, along with something slightly rancid. You pass huts that seem to lean toward each other like gossiping old women, their timber frames crooked from centuries of bad maintenance and worse weather. A dog eyes you suspiciously from under a cart. It's guarding something wrapped in cloth. Meat? No, just another bundle of stale bread. Hard as guilt, inside a nearby cottage, the family dinner is underway. A pot hangs over the hearth, bubbling lazily. You lean closer. Turnips. Just turnips. Maybe a single onion sacrificed for flavor. They pass around a rough wooden bowl and take polite spoonfuls like they're enjoying it. But their eyes say otherwise. This is not a meal. This is survival by root vegetable. The average peasant in the 13th century lived off what the land gave them, and the land, frankly, wasn't generous. Mostly barley, rye, and oats. Wheat? That was luxury cereal. Your bread's probably maslin, a mix of rye and wheat, and it tastes exactly how it sounds, like punishment. The coarse grind often includes bits of husk, dirt, and if you're lucky, a little beetle protein for free. Historians still argue whether millers intentionally adulterated the flour or whether it was just impossible to keep rats and grime out of the mix. Either way, you're chewing regret. And don't ask about butter. Only the well-off had that creamy luxury. You, dear time traveler, get lard if there's any pig fat left from last winter's slaughter. It tastes like someone's bitter memory. Oh, and those lovely feasts you've seen in movies? Wrong century, wrong class. Peasants had no tableware, barely any tables, and forget forks. They won't be common for hundreds of years. You'd rip bread with your hands, sop up stew straight from a bowl, and hope your fingers weren't still sticky from mucking out the goat pen. A mainstream fact here. Grain made up roughly 70 to 80% of a medieval peasant's diet. You were basically a walking barley bag. But the twist? Sometimes even that wasn't available. Crop failure? That meant famine. And famine meant you might eat bark. Actual bark. One 14th century account tells of villagers boiling grass and leather. Your great culinary comeback? Soup made from boiled shoe leather with a hint of despair. In one recorded case, people were so desperate they ground up ferns to mix with flour. Which sounds okay, until you realize bracken fern is mildly toxic. Historians still argue whether this kind of desperation was rare or more common than records let on, because no one exactly wanted to write, "Ate weeds again today, feeling woozy, might be dying." And that hunger? It's constant. You don't really fill up in the modern sense. You eat until the pot is empty, not until you feel full. Your body learns to function on less, to scrape by on porridge and prayer. Joke break? Sure. Here's one. What's the difference between a medieval dinner and a punishment? The punishment comes with a warning. Still peckish? Don't go sniffing around the village bakeries again. Remember your cracked tooth? That wasn't a one-time deal. Bakers were often fined for short-weight loaves, meaning they tried to sell undersized bread. Some even kept extra dough to one side to make up for fines they expected to get. That's how normal the cheating was. And yet, There's a strange charm to it, isn't there? The resilience. The family gathered around the fire. The way even the blandest stew was shared with quiet gratitude. They lived knowing famine might be around the next season. And still, they sang songs, told stories, and passed that lumpy bread with a tired smile. It's not a banquet, but it's something like life. Raw, humble, unfiltered, and right about now, your stomach, back here in the 21st century, might be making very modern growling sounds. Maybe you start appreciating your leftovers a little more. Maybe that half-eaten sandwich in your fridge starts looking like a miracle because in the medieval world, you have licked that sandwich clean and dreamed about it for a week. You move on, thinking maybe you just had a rough start. Surely there's something out there that tastes better than rock bread and swamp soup. You wander deeper into the village and find a gathering near a barrel. People are laughing softly, sipping from wooden mugs. At last, wine. Or so you think. You eagerly take a sip, expecting warmth, depth, a bit of old-world sophistication. Instead, it's sour, sharp. Your mouth puckers involuntarily. Whatever this is, it isn't wine. It's vinegar with dreams. And yet they're drinking it like it's fine vintage. That's when it hits you. Nothing here tastes like you expect. Everything's either spoiled, diluted, or deliberately messed with to hide how bad it really is. See, in the medieval world, food preservation was a daily struggle. You either ate something fast or got creative with how to keep it edible. For drinks like wine and ale, spoilage was normal. Fermentation wasn't always well controlled, and barrels could be reused for years without proper cleaning. Some vintners added chalk, lead, or even quicklime to improve the flavor or color. Lead, yes, because who doesn't want a little brain damage with their buzz? Historians still argue whether this was widespread or just an occasional shady merchant trick. But either way, you're sipping something that's had more chemistry than taste testing. Over at a makeshift cheese stall, someone slices off a thick wedge of something that smells aggressive. It's greenish, slightly fuzzy, and oozing the way cheese probably shouldn't. You lean closer. Mold, but not the fancy gourmet kind. We don't have refrigeration, and the mice got here first, kind of mold, but the locals seem fine with it. They scrape off the worst bits and eat around the rest. Waste not, want not. Fun fact, back then, fresh cheese didn't mean creamy brie. It meant something like farmer's cheese, made within a day or two and eaten immediately before it turned. Aged cheeses were risky business, unless you had a monastery nearby. The monks knew what they were doing. Everyone else? They were playing dairy roulette. You find a merchant bragging about his imported wine from Bordeaux. He lets you try it. It's better. Still sharp, still cloudy, but there's a ghost of grapes in there somewhere. He winks and says it's been stretched. And by that, he means he watered it down to make it last longer and then added something like honey, or in some cases lead acetate, to sweeten it up. Historians still debate how much of nobility actually suffered lead poisoning from this. But the symptoms, irritability, tremors, insanity, show up suspiciously often in royal records. Coincidence? You drift toward another crowd. This time around a barrel marked with a crude fish symbol. Pickled herring. It's been sitting there for days. Maybe weeks. The barrel smells like regret, and the fish itself? It's so salty it could mummify your tongue. Salt was precious, though, and used in industrial amounts to keep things edible. No cold storage, remember. Your fish either gets brined, smoked, or eaten fast. And by fast, we mean before it grows legs and walks away. Still hungry? Maybe sweets are safer. You eye a tray of pastries. Now we're talking. You bite into one and instantly regret it. The dough is tough. The filling is indistinguishable, and there's a crunch that definitely shouldn't be there. Oh no, not again. A small pebble stares up at you like it's proud of itself. Bakers often bulked up flour with ground beans, lentils, or chalk. One court record from 14th century London accused a baker of mixing plaster into his dough. Delightful. And if the ingredients didn't ruin it, the flavor profiles might. Medieval folks had a different sense of what goes together. You'll find pies with minced meat, prunes, hard-boiled eggs, and saffron all mixed together like a dare. Spices were rare and expensive, so when people could use them, they didn't hold back. Nutmeg, cinnamon, and clove. On fish, on eggs, on anything. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it was chaos on a plate. Quick sidebar. The whole idea that medieval people used spices to cover the taste of rotten meat, that's a myth. Spices were way too expensive to waste on bad food. More likely, the food was just naturally bad, and they were trying to make it palatable, not high decay. Still, historians argue about how accessible spices were to different social classes. There's evidence of modest spice use even among the middle class in cities. And then there's ale. Ubiquitous, comforting, safe, theoretically. It's the daily drink, partly because water can literally kill you. We'll get to that in the next section. But the ale you're handed here is warm, flat, and full of bits. It's made without hops. Those don't become common in England until much later, and it spoils fast. Breweries are often women-run operations called alewives. You'd recognize them by their distinctive tall hats and broomsticks hung outside, a strange but true origin of the modern witch stereotype. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some brewers were known to whisper charms over barrels for better fermentation. Superstition and science went hand in hand, sometimes dangerously. By now, you're feeling a little queasy. That first bite of bread set the tone. The vinegar wine didn't help, and your gut is making a sound that might be medieval for send help. The locals are fine, of course. Their bodies are trained for this. They've spent a lifetime building immunity to mystery mold and spoiled meat. You have a probiotic yogurt habit and a sensitive stomach. You probably won't survive this. So you lean against a post, stomach churning, eyes watery. Maybe food here wasn't meant to taste good. Maybe it was just meant to be survived. A means to an end. Energy for plowing fields and burying neighbors. And as another mug of murky ale is passed your way, you realize something sobering. If this is a feast day, you don't want to know what a bad day tastes like. You wake up the next morning, if morning is the right word for the gray smear of sky overhead. You're still hungry, but the bar for what counts as edible has dropped considerably. Your dreams were haunted by crunchy pastries and ghostly herring barrels. So you do what any desperate medieval villager would do. You follow the smell of something boiling. A communal fire pit, smoke curling upward like tired sighs, is surrounded by 3 women stirring a massive cauldron. The scent? Earthy. Maybe savory. Maybe. You inch closer. Inside the pot is brown. That's all you can tell. Brown chunks. Brown water. Brown foam. You're about to taste the legendary peasant stew. The term pottage comes to mind, a medieval staple so iconic, it's basically peasant cuisine's answer to ramen. Cheap, flexible, and infinite in possibility. But don't get excited. This isn't grandma's chicken soup. This is a semi-liquid mystery composed of root vegetables, a few stray grains, and if fortune smiles, the occasional shred of meat so tiny you wonder if it actually counts. The texture is somewhere between porridge and paste. It coats your tongue like wallpaper glue and leaves a bitter finish, as though the turnip in question held a grudge. But you eat it because you need to, and because everyone else is eating it, too. Pottage was the all-day, everyday meal for most of the medieval population. Historians estimate that the average peasant had the same dish for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Think of it as eternal crock-pot meal. Stuff goes in, simmers forever, gets eaten, then more stuff goes in. There's no fresh batch, just continuous cooking. Some households might have kept the pot going for days, just refilling and reheating until the flavor gave up and left entirely. You ask what's in this one. A woman shrugs and says, "Turnip. Oh, last week's leek and bits." Bits. You decide not to investigate. And here's the kicker. You're lucky if it even tastes like something. In many parts of Europe, flavor was an afterthought. Salt was expensive. Herbs were seasonal. You might find wild garlic if it's spring, or pennyroyal if someone in your village moonlights as an herbalist. But mostly you're working with bland. Medieval bland, which is somehow worse than regular bland because it always hints at decay. A mainstream historical fact. Meat consumption was shockingly low for most peasants. It's not that they were vegetarians by choice, they just couldn't get it. Forest laws prevented hunting. We'll tackle that later. And domestic livestock was too valuable to slaughter often. So unless a pig was butchered for winter, you weren't seeing bacon anytime soon. When meat did make it into the stew, it was usually offguts, organs, tails, hooves. The kinds of things modern folks politely discard or turn into hot dogs. But here, those bits are prized. A knuckle bone in your pottage is like winning the lottery. It gives the broth flavor, even if chewing it feels like licking a tree root. And here's a fringe tidbit to stir your pot. Some families added animal blood to thicken the stew. It's not as wild as it sounds. Blood, pudding, and black soup were common in several medieval cultures. High in iron, low in squeamishness. As you sit with your bowl, you notice something else. People are dipping stale bread into the stew to soften it. And suddenly, the pebble-filled horror from yesterday makes sense. It was never meant to be eaten alone. It was designed to soak up whatever warmth and moisture to find, transforming into something vaguely tolerable. Still, your stomach doesn't quite agree. It protests with low rumbles, like thunder behind distant hills. You try to ignore it. Everyone around you seems perfectly fine. A kid slurps from his bowl like it's the best thing he's ever had. An old man hums as he chews. You're focusing hard on not gagging as you find something stringy and unidentifiable floating near the surface. Historians still argue whether this kind of monotony caused real long-term malnutrition, or whether people adapted to it nutritionally. Some records show chronic vitamin deficiencies, especially in bad harvest years, while others suggest peasants knew how to balance their diets with seasonal foraging. Either way, no one's getting a Michelin star. Then, as if to answer your growing nausea, someone hands you a boiled egg. Hope flares, until you crack it open and find it sulfurous, overcooked, and vaguely green around the yolk. Still better than stew. You bite it in silence, chewing like a soldier in a trench. And here comes joke number 2. Why did the medieval peasant bring a ladder to dinner? Because they heard the stew was hearty and needed a way to climb out of it. You wipe your hands on a linen cloth so rough it could exfoliate your ancestors and head toward a nearby orchard. Fruit, actual flavor. You pluck an apple, take a bite, and nearly break a tooth. It's rock hard and sour, picked way too early or left on the branch too long. Medieval apples weren't the sweet, wax delights we enjoy now. Most were bred for cider, not snacking. You'd need to stew or roast them to get any pleasure out of it. Nearby, a woman is mashing crab apples into a mush for a sauce called verjuice, used to give some brightness to the otherwise lifeless dishes. It's like medieval lemon juice, only with more pucker and less vitamin C. It's at this point you realize food in this era isn't about joy. It's about sustenance. Your daily calories come from whatever you can boil, mash, or ferment. Your tongue is an afterthought. Your gut is a battlefield. And your standards? Oh, they've gone out with yesterday's dishwater. Still, you sit with the villagers around the fire, bowl in hand. Someone passes you a handful of nuts. Hazelnuts, probably. You crack one open. It's fresh earthy and delicious in a way only something unspoiled can be. You smile, and for a moment, the stew, the sour wine, the crunchy pastries all fade until you smell what's next in the pot. Hint, it's eel. You hear the word before you see the thing. Eel. Your stomach gives a nervous twitch. Someone next to you perks up like it's their birthday. Fresh catch, they say, as those slimy aquatic serpents are something to celebrate. The cauldron bubbles ominously. A young boy holds up a wriggling mass by the tail. Long, shiny, still slightly twitching. You watch as it's dropped unceremoniously into the pot with a heavy plop. The crowd leans in, eager. You lean back, queasy. Welcome to river cuisine. If you're lucky enough to live near a body of water, congratulations. You get to diversify your misery. Eel, lamprey, pike, perch. Slippery, boneless, and incredibly hard to catch without specialized nets or bare-handed desperation. But they're a vital source of protein, and in some regions, particularly during Lent or religious fasts, these writhing noodlefish are the only meat you're allowed. There's even a long-standing debate about whether barnacle geese were considered fish just so monks could eat them on Fridays. Historians still argue whether that loophole was pious creativity or straight-up culinary cheating. Back to your eel. It's now soft, flaky, and resting in your bowl like it's done something wrong. The meat itself is fine, oily, tender, but the real problem is the broth. Thick, yellowish, and spiced with something that smells like regret and maybe wild thyme. Still, everyone slurps it down, because in medieval life, you eat what's available, not what sounds good. And fish, particularly eel, was available in astonishing quantities. In fact, some peasants even paid rent in eels. No joke. A 10th century English document lists eel-based rent dues in the thousands. Imagine paying your landlord with a bucket of slimy wrigglers. Here's this month's rent. Mind the splash. You wash it down with more ale. It tastes the same as yesterday's, like barley tea brewed in a boot, but it's better than water, and that's saying something. Let's talk about water for a moment. You'd think a nice, clear stream would be safe. Wrong. In medieval times, water sources were routinely contaminated with animal waste, rotting matter, and, well, worse. Some towns had public latrines perched over rivers, under the delusion that the current will carry it away. Charming. In cities, waste was often dumped right into the streets, where it slowly flowed, or didn't, toward a ditch or drain. And guess what? Those same ditches sometimes connected to wells. Yum. That's why ale, cider, or watered-down wine were considered safe. Not because they were alcoholics, but because the fermentation process, accidental as it often was, killed the bacteria that water couldn't. You, with your bottled spring water and Brita filter, wouldn't last a day. Fringe tidbit for you. Some nuns in the Low Countries experimented with distillation techniques centuries before it was widespread. They were trying to make medicinal tinctures and ended up with early versions of schnapps. Accidental progress, courtesy of monastic science, and a desperate need to avoid dysentery. Now back to fish. You wander toward the market to see what else the local waters have surrendered. There's a table covered in dried fish, wrinkled, salt-crusted husks that look more like fossils than food. You pick one up, and it audibly cracks. The seller smiles like that's a good thing. Smoked and salted fish were essential for surviving the lean months. Cod from the North Atlantic, for instance, became a medieval trade giant. Stockfish, unsalted, air-dried cod, was practically currency in Northern Europe. Cheap, durable, and so tough you had to hammer it before cooking. That's not an exaggeration. People use literal mallets to break it into edible chunks. You pass another stall where a man is stirring a barrel of pickled lampreys. They look like fat worms with teeth. You suppress a shiver. Royals love lampreys. King Henry I of England reportedly died after eating too many of them. Historians still argue whether it was the fish's age or an unrelated illness, but the official blame landed squarely on the lamprey. Death by delicacy. Someone offers you a lamprey pie, and your polite refusal earns a curious glance. They're royal food, the cook insists proudly, baked with pepper and ginger and everything. You nod, smile, and back away slowly like the pie might bite. The variety of river and sea creatures eaten in the Middle Ages is frankly impressive. Mussels, oysters, crawfish, all harvested in great numbers when available, but with preservation always a challenge. You rarely got them fresh unless you lived right on the coast. Inland, you got pickled, salted, or smoked versions, and that brings its own surprises. One monk wrote of red herrings that burn the tongue, likely due to oversalting. Another chronicler described fermented fish that stung the nose like fire. It's hard to know if that was a spice experiment gone wrong, or just an early version of what today we'd call a Scandinavian delicacy. Either way, your modern digestive system isn't ready. Quick joke break. Why did the fish vendor get kicked out of the tavern? Because he always left a bad smell behind. You find a quiet place near the riverbank, away from the relentless bubbling of stew pots and eel guts. The water trickles gently, seemingly clean, but you know better. Still, the view is peaceful, and for a moment, the food stress lifts. You think about how hard it is to live like this, how constant the hunger must be, how meals are rarely about joy. There's no dinner party, no flavor explosion, no seconds for fun, just fuel, day after day. And if the river dries up or the nets fail, you're done. No Uber Eats in the 12th century. A child runs past you with a wooden bucket full of tiny fish. Minnows. Maybe someone will mash them into paste or dry them on a board. You watch the bucket slosh and think about how easy it is to take a pantry for granted. In your world, hunger is an inconvenience. Here is an identity. You sigh and stand, brushing dust from your tunic. Your stomach growls again, and for the first time, you wonder if you're actually starting to get used to this. Not enjoying it, but adapting, the way your ancestors did, and those before them, until someone nearby cracks open a fermenting barrel of fish sauce. Nope, you're definitely not ready for that. You try not to breathe through your nose. That barrel, is the kind of thing you smell before you see, and long after you wish you hadn't. The fish sauce inside is thick, brownish gray, and deeply suspicious. A villager stirs it with a wooden paddle, and a rich, briny funk rises that makes your eyes water. Someone nearby says it's garum. You blink. Wait, you think, asterisk, isn't that Roman? Asterisk, yes, in good memory. But versions of garum look Quayman, or just plain fermented fish who survived long past the fall of Rome. In medieval Europe, especially around the Mediterranean, the stinky sludge was the seasoning of champions, or at least survivors. It was cheap, protein-rich, and believe it or not, desirable. One sniff tells you everything you need to know about medieval resilience. You watch as a ladleful is drizzled over some boiled grains. The recipient smiles in anticipation. That's when you realize, in a world where salt is expensive and spices are rare, garum is flavor. It may smell like despair, but to a medieval palate dulled by centuries of monotony, it's practically magic. A mainstream historical fact? Spices in medieval Europe were insanely valuable, not just for cooking, but for status. Black pepper was so prized that nobles stored it in lockboxes like jewelry. A pound of cinnamon could cost as much as a whole cow. So unless you're at court or robbing caravans, you're seasoning your food with salt, onions, herbs, or, yes, fish sauce. You wander the back of the village market, where local seasonings are laid out. There's dried mustard seed, garlic bulbs strung together like pearls of poverty, and wild horseradish that smells like it could cure the plague. A woman is pounding herbs with vinegar in a mortar, making something she calls green sauce. You dip a finger in. It's sharp, grassy, and surprisingly good. You smile, and she gives you a look like, don't get used to it. Most of the time, if your stew or fish or bread tastes like anything, it's thanks to these humble additions: leeks, mint, parsley, sage. You spot nettle leaves drying on a mat. Not just for tea, nettles went into pottage, pies, and even beer. Historians still argue whether they were used primarily for nutrition or simply because they were the only green thing not yet wilted or cursed. But don't forget, flavor wasn't just a matter of taste. It was a matter of medicine. According to humoral theory, the dominant medical belief of the time, foods had hot, cold, wet, and dry properties. You had to balance them to maintain health. Spices weren't just flavoring. They were medicine. Too much garlic? You risked overheating your blood. Not enough salt? Your bowel might misbehave. It's like doing chemistry homework every time you cook dinner. Only the penalty for miscalculating is mysterious death. You think back to the garlic from earlier and suddenly feel very hot and dry. Or maybe you're just nauseous and the garum fumes still lingering in your hair. Fringe fact for your mental spice rack. In some parts of medieval Eastern Europe, they used ash, yes, ash, as a seasoning. Burnt plant ash was sifted and added to porridge or stew for its mineral content. So the next time someone says your toast is burnt, tell them you're just going medieval. Your eye catches on a cart full of tiny clay pots. Most are filled with honey. Now this is something to get excited about. Golden, thick, and actually sweet. One of the few real indulgences for a medieval peasant. You taste a drop. It's floral, intense, and hallelujah, asterisk, not disgusting, asterisk. Honey was a prized commodity, used for everything from glazing meat to preserving fruit, and even making mead, that honey wine of Viking dreams. Sugar existed too, brought through trade from the East, but it was outrageously expensive. For regular folks like you, honey was sugar, a joke to sweeten the moment. Why don't medieval bakers ever tell secrets? Because their flour always leaks. Back to your honey moment. You dip a crust of yesterday's bread into it, and for once, your teeth don't rebel. The sweetness is so rare, so utterly rare, it makes you emotional. It's like finding a Wi-Fi signal in the middle of the woods. Brief, glorious, and almost mythical. But don't get too comfortable. Beeswax candles are expensive and daylight's burning. You follow the flow of foot traffic back toward the hearth, and suddenly there's a familiar smell: smoke, grease, and burning hair. Roasting meat. Your heart skips a beat. You haven't smelled actual roasting meat since, well, maybe ever. A family is spitting a rabbit over an open flame. It's singed, lean, and rotating slowly over coals. You lean in. It's almost hypnotic. But don't get your hopes up. You're not part of that family, and rabbits, unless they're poached from the Lord's land, are not easy to come by. Game laws were strict, and hunting the king's deer could get you whipped, imprisoned, or worse. Yes, worse, like having your hands chopped off. So you keep your distance and try not to drool. Meanwhile, someone tosses you a boiled egg. Again, this one is cold and slightly rubbery. But hey, it's protein, and you will take it. The food landscape is a gamble. One day you get eel. The next day you get green sauce and ash porridge. If you're especially unlucky, you get gruel made from ground acorns. Yes, acorns. People actually leached the bitterness from acorns and used them as flour substitutes when grains ran out. Desperate times, desperate diets. You pause to reflect. The flavors of medieval life aren't just bad. They're inconsistent, unpredictable, and often tied to your social standing. The rich ate saffron lace pastries. The poor ate pottage with bits. And you're somewhere in between, watching the rabbit roast, holding your boiled egg, and wondering what tomorrow's fish sauce will bring. Someone sneezes behind you, violently, and you realize You have no napkin, no tissue, just your sleeve. Welcome to the seasoning of medieval life. Sweat, ash, garlic, and the faint tang of despair. You wake up hungry. Again, not the modern, oops, I skipped breakfast, kinda hungry. No, this is a gnawing, hollow kind that makes you question your life choices and consider whether tree bark might be edible if you chew long enough. It's market day, and you're hoping to score anything that isn't boiled or beige. The village square is packed, but don't get excited. Most of it is turnips. Mountains of turnips. Turnips pretending to be other vegetables. Turnips trying to pass as meat. You sigh. Welcome to the world of medieval substitutes. Take a long, unblinking look at that loaf of bread on the merchant's table. Looks normal, right? Brown, dense, rustic. Now tap it. Harder. You hear that? That's not a crust. That's a warning. Bread in the Middle Ages was a dietary cornerstone, but also a dental trap. The poorest classes relied on coarse bread made from barley, rye, or even mashed beans. Wheat? That was for the nobility. The rest of you chewed through what essentially amounted to edible sandpaper. And here's the kicker. A lot of flour was patted out with filler. Not just acorns and peas, but sometimes chalk, ground bones, or dusty sweepings from the mill floor. Historians still argue whether this was intentional fraud or just efficient use of available resources. Either way, enjoy that crunchy surprise in your next bite. It's like trail mix, but medieval. Fringe tidbit. Archaeologists have found cornstone grit embedded in the teeth of skeletons from this era. People literally ground down their molars from years of chewing this abrasive bread. So yes, you are slowly sandpapering your face off every time you bite into a slice. You take a bite of the loaf and try not to wince. It's dense enough to stun a goose. The outside is burned, the inside still slightly wet, and there's a suspicious gray streak running through the middle. You convince yourself it's ash. You hope it's ash. Your host offers you some trencher bread. This one's even tougher. A stale slab uses both a plate and a sponge. After meals, the rich would give these grease-soaked trenchers to beggars, which, honestly, is better than nothing. But you can't help but notice it tastes exactly like it smells. Old meat, wood smoke, and thyme. Still, it fills your stomach. Kind of. Nearby, you overhear a conversation about horse bread. Not for people, literally for horses. It's made from chaff, bran, and anything not good enough for human consumption. And yet, in the darkest times, famine, siege, crop failure, humans ate it too. Hunger does strange things to pride. And famine? It wasn't rare. Failed harvest could devastate an entire region. One bad winter. One locust swarm. One lord who taxes grain beyond reason. And suddenly you're boiling your shoe leather and pretending it's beef. There's a real account of people making soup from boiled grass and leaves. That's not poetic. That's just despair with a garnish. To make things worse, most of your crops aren't protected. If a storm floods your field, you lose everything. No insurance. No government bailout. Just a year of tight belts and even tighter morals. A joke? Okay, what are medieval chefs' favorite seasoning? Hunger. But there's some light among the gloom. People are surprisingly creative with what little they have. You spot a peasant woman stirring something thick and brown over a low fire. She tells you it's frumenty, made from boiled wheat berries, spiced with cinnamon if you're lucky, or onions if you're not. Sometimes it's sweet, sometimes savory. Today it's well ambiguous. You try a spoonful. It's like eating wet gravel that dreams of becoming oatmeal. But it's warm, and warm counts for a lot. One old man tells you proudly that his family has a secret porridge recipe passed down for generations. You ask what makes it special. He leans in, grinning, and whispers, "We stir it counterclockwise." Not exactly the culinary revolution you hope for. But hey, tradition is tradition. And then there's pottage, the eternal stew, a bubbling, ever-changing cauldron of whatever we found today. Beans, grains, old cabbage, bit of onion, maybe a bone that the dog didn't get to at first. Pottage was a communal dish, simmering for days. Add to it, ladle from it, pray over it. Repeat. You approach one such pot. A thin broth splashes the rim. Inside, a sad carrot floats like it's contemplating its life choices. You dip a spoon and taste. It's not awful. It's just relentlessly humble, like it knows it's not the hero of your meal, just a sidekick doing its best. Still, pottage could be a lifesaver, especially when made thicker with lentils or peas. A good pottage was the difference between a weak day and a fatal one. You might not remember what it tasted like, but you'd remember if it wasn't there. Some regions even developed unique versions. Scotland had brose, oatmeal with boiling water or broth, while in Eastern Europe, millet mush held its own. Simple, heavy, and designed to stick to your ribs, or possibly break them. And now for a fringe cultural note. In certain Slavic villages, ceremonial pottage was offered to household spirits, literal bowls of stew left out overnight to keep the supernatural realm happy. Historians still argue whether this was pure superstition or a clever psychological trick to ration food. By now, your tongue is coated in starch. You crave something acidic, a pickle, a fruit, anything. But preserved fruits are rare and expensive. You might get a wrinkled plum if you're lucky, or a cider-soaked apple that's more fermented than fresh, which brings you to fermentation. Again, remember those sour alish and fish sauces? Fermenting wasn't just a preservation method. It was practically a religion. Sauerkraut, sour rye mash, pickled beets, even eggs steeped in brine until they reach a state best described as defensive. You try one. It fights back. You head toward a small wooden cart selling vinegar and mustard paste. These are the real saviors of medieval blandness. A dab of sharp mustard can turn your boiled grain into something almost memorable. Almost. Your final bite of the day is a tiny cheese curd wrapped in cloth. It's tangy, soft, and shockingly pleasant. You savor it like a stolen treasure. Because here's the secret truth of medieval food. It's not always bad. Sometimes it's just boring. But every so often, through sheer luck or desperation, something works. A crisp apple, a soft cheese, a sweet spoonful of fruity with dried berries if you're very lucky. And when that happens for a moment, you almost forget the chalk bread and bone soup. Almost. You wake before dawn, stirred by the clang of iron on stone, someone sharpening a blade, or maybe cracking open a frozen barrel. Either way, your stomach is already grumbling. Again. But today isn't about eating. It's about who gets to eat, and more importantly, how much. In this world, food isn't just nourishment. It's status, symbol, law. And you're about to learn that what ends up on your plate has less to do with your appetite and more to do with who you're not. Let's start simple. Sumptuary laws. These weren't your average no shirt, no service rules. These were government-backed guidelines telling people what they could wear, own, and yes, asterisk eat star. In England, for instance, certain game meats, like deer, swan, or peacock, were legally reserved for the nobility, not just discouraged. Illegal. You, dear commoner, might snare a rabbit on the sly. But a fat, glossy venison roast? Off limits unless you're a lord or planning to be executed by one. And yes, that includes fish. On certain days, especially Fridays and during Lent, you weren't allowed meat at all. The church decreed it. Fish was fair game, and so the wealthier folks gorge on freshwater delicacies, pike, trout, even sturgeon, while the rest of you hoped your salted herring didn't taste too much like a barnacle's retirement home. Historians still argue whether these fasting days help create health benefits or simply mask seasonal scarcity. Either way, your diet wasn't entirely in your hands. It was in the churches, your lords, and more often than not, God's. Your next lesson in edible inequality is found at a manor table. You're invited to watch, not to dine. Let's be clear about that. The table is long, heavy, and gleaming with platters of meat you've never even smelled before. A roast bull with an apple in its mouth. Glistening pies with steam curling like cathedral incense. Birds served whole. Feathers, beaks, and all, just to prove they could. You spot a server removing a pie crust lid to reveal not fruit, but minced goose and dates soaked in wine. That crust? It won't be eaten. It's just a container. The rich don't bother with trenchers or edible bowls. The crust is discarded, or worse, thrown to the dogs. Meanwhile, back in the village, you're rationing dried peas and debating whether boiled thistle counts as dinner. A joke as you marvel. Why did the noble never finish his pheasant? Because it lacked the dignity of a third course. Class divided not just the food itself, but how it was served. Nobles use pewter, silver, sometimes gold. You're lucky if your bowl hasn't been patched with beeswax. And don't even think about cutlery. Forks were exotic, frowned upon as effeminate in many places. Most people use knives, or just their hands. You glance at your fingers, stained from garlic and turnip sap. Meanwhile, a noble woman dabs delicately at her lips with a linen cloth, her cup brimming with sweetened wine. Yours is probably full of gritty ale, or maybe barley water, thick, sour, and cloudy enough to qualify as a weather pattern. But the biggest gap isn't just what's served. It's when. The elite might enjoy several small meals a day, full of variety. You, one or two if you're lucky. A big meal around midday, and maybe something small after sunset. That's it. Snacking? Not really a thing. You're either working, sleeping, or scrounging. There's no Netflix and cheese in your future. Back in the village, the lines are even clearer. A miller, wealthy by peasant standards, has finer flour and real butter. You're still eating chalky rye and scraping goose fat off reused parchment. One fringe tidbit. Some lords kept live fish in stone ponds near their manors. When they wanted fish, they'd just scoop one out and cook it fresh. You hope yours isn't salted past the point of identity. You begin to notice another pattern. Who served the food? Even within a household, there are lines. The eldest son might get the thickest cut. The youngest, more broth than bite. Guests rank above family. Priests above farmers. It's a hierarchy that spills into every ladle, every crumb, every mealtime prayer. And yes, there are prayers. Food is holy, or at least it's supposed to be. Wasting it, a sin. Sharing it, a virtue. Unless, of course, you're nobility. In which case you can launch a pear tart across the hall in a fit of pique and nobody will blink. You ask an old woman about the worst winter she remembers. She nods slowly. I once traded my shoes for a bowl of hot milk, she says, eyes fogged with memory. You don't ask if it was worth it. You already know the answer. By the time evening falls, the Lord's feast is winding down. Drunken laughter echoes across the courtyard, and scraps are tossed to hounds with better posture than most peasants. You shuffle away, your own meal of brittle crust soaked in weak ale. Still, you've learned something tonight. In the medieval world, food isn't just calories. It's currency. It's caste. It's control. And whether you feast or famine depends not on what you can cook, but on who you are and who you aren't. You're standing in a medieval kitchen now, or what passes for one. It's hot, smoky, and somehow both damp and dusty. Every surface is blackened from soot or streaked with grease. You duck beneath low beams and try not to trip over a goose that's both alive and extremely offended by your presence. Tonight's menu? Meat, allegedly, but don't get excited. See, cooking in medieval times wasn't about flavor. It was about not dying. Preservation was king and freshness a luxury. Everything was either salted, dried, smoked, or pickled. You'd think that'd keep things safe. It didn't. You glance over at a lump of salted pork the size of a toddler. It's been hanging from the rafters for months, crusted in thick white crystals. The cook nods at it proudly. Still good, she says, slapping it like it's a dependable old mule. You're not so sure. Historians still argue whether meat preservation methods were effective or just gave people stronger stomachs out of sheer necessity. But here's the truth. Most of what people ate had already started to go a bit funky before it hit the fire. Speaking of fire, you're choking on smoke. Chimneys aren't standard yet. Most homes, especially rural ones, just let smoke curl upward and escape through holes in the thatch. If it escapes at all, your eyes water, your throat burns. You now understand why medieval paintings feature so many people outside. But let's talk technique. Cooking wasn't precise. No timers, no thermometers. Just instinct, prayer, and occasional toe dipped into boiling stew. You watch a woman test if a pot is ready by tossing in a handful of oats and listening for a certain kind of bubble. That's not science. That's wizardry. And ovens? Rare. Most people cooked over open hearths using cauldrons, spits, and stones heated in the fire then dropped into pots. Baking bread often meant lugging your dough to the communal oven, if your village even had one, and praying it didn't get swapped or stolen. Which, yes, totally happened. Bread fraud was real. One friar wrote of a woman who found a rat tail baked into her neighbor's loaf. Hard to say what's worse, the rat tail or the theft. Your next sensory adventure is the meat spit. A boy, maybe 10 years old, turns it endlessly, slowly, all day. It's his job. Just turning, over and over, dripping fat hissing into the fire. They were called turn broaches, and if ever there was a poster child for medieval culinary misery, it was them. One fringe tidbit. Some castles used dogs to power rotating spits, literal canine treadmills. Fido got a workout while the roast got a tan. Back to the meat. The outside chars beautifully, sure, but the inside, often raw. There's no real way to check. You poke it with a stick and hope it doesn't bleed. Congratulations! Rare meat with a side of dysentery. Food safety wasn't a known concept. People believed in humors, not bacteria. Your roast chicken could have been pecking at garbage an hour ago. Doesn't matter. If it's cooked, it's clean. Right? And what about milk? In theory, a perfect food. In reality, a microbial minefield. Fresh milk spoiled within hours. Most peasants didn't drink it straight. They turned it into cheese or let it sour naturally into something vaguely yogurt-like. You're handed a mug of clabber. You sip. It's like drinking a wet sock that once knew a cow. Butter? Rarer still. Hard to churn when you can barely feed your livestock. You might get drippings, animal fat collected from roasts, used for cooking, rubbing on bread, or in winter, as makeshift lip balm. You grimace. It tastes like beefy regret. Still, there are bright spots. You watch a woman stir onions, herbs, and wine into a stew. It smells surprisingly good. Medieval cooks had access to herbs. Parsley, sage, thyme, garlic, grown in kitchen gardens or foraged nearby. And when the cook knows what she's doing, even turnips can be tasty. Almost. But spice? That's another story. Spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, were imported and outrageously expensive. Think worth more than gold levels. Nobles flaunted spice in their food the way billionaires show off yachts. Pepper wasn't about taste. It was about flexing. That said, The myth that spices were used to hide rotting meat? Historians still argue. Truth is, no one wasted precious saffron on spoiled beef. If it was bad, you fed it to the pigs. If you had pigs. If not, well, maybe you fed it to your in-laws. Who's to say? For peasants, most meals were boiled. Think stews, porridges, gruels. The longer you boiled it, the safer it was. Also, the more it resembled a beige mudslide. You watch the cook pour something from a clay pot into a bowl. It jiggles. Not in the cute Jell-O dessert way. More like a nervous custard. It's calf's foot jelly, she says brightly. Good for your bones. You stare at it, unsure whether to thank her or run. You eat it. It tastes like a cold handshake. But despite it all, the smoke, the spoiled milk, the rat tail scandals, there's care here. Even pride. Cooks memorize family recipes, pass them down, tweak, and improve them. They may not have our gadgets, but they know their ingredients. And when everything aligns, fresh herbs, slow simmer, good bread, it works. You taste a lentil and barley stew that somehow comforts you, like a blanket in a bowl. And here's your quirky final note. Some recipes from medieval times survive today. More truths. For instance, an old dish of minced meat, breadcrumbs, and spices is the ancestor of modern meatloaf. The lineage of comfort food is longer than you think. You finish your night in the kitchen with clothes soaked in smoke, fingers oily with goose fat, and breath that could frighten the stable. But you're oddly satisfied because you've learned something. In a world where ingredients are unreliable, fuel is precious, and food poisoning lurks in every corner, cooking wasn't just about survival. It was a craft, a ritual, a battle, and somehow they made it taste like home. The wind picks up as you step outside, curling around your ankles like a cat made of smoke and chill. Tonight, it carries something foul, not just a familiar tang of livestock or the sourness of sweat and mud, but something sharper, darker, a reminder that in medieval times, spoiled food wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a death sentence wearing a side of cabbage. You trudge through the narrow alleys behind the tavern, past a heap of onion skins and a puddle that smells like it's been fermenting since last harvest. Sanitation? Ha! The concept barely exists. You got refuse tossed from windows, got spilling from slaughtered animals into ditches, and water sources bubbling with flavor. The stream you kneel beside looks clean, trickles like a lullaby, but lurking inside could be cholera, typhoid, or parasites too small to see, but very willing to move in. You fill your flask, but sip it only after boiling, or maybe not at all. Better thirsty than unconscious. And yet, water is crucial, especially for cooking. So, many turn to wheat beer, small ale, as it was called. Not because they liked to party, but because boiling the water during brewing killed enough germs to make it safer than a bubbling brook. Even children drank it, which explains a lot about medieval playground injuries. But if water could hurt you, food could straight up betray you. Take ergot, for example, a fungus that loves to infect rye. Bread made from ergoty grain caused hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes death. The symptoms? Creepy enough to inspire witchcraft legends. People danced uncontrollably in fields, saw things that weren't there, lost limbs to gangrene. Historians still argue whether entire outbreaks of so-called dancing plagues were really just mass poisoning by moldy toast. And that's not even counting botulism, silent, deadly, and more likely when people tried preserving meats or fish in airtight pots with zero understanding of microbial warfare. One bad batch of potted eel, and boom, good night. You step into a storeroom. Shelves creak beneath clay jars sealed with wax and old cloth. You lift the lid. Inside, some sort of pickled root vegetable floats in murky vinegar. Harmless? Probably. Delicious? Not even close. But at least it won't kill you this time. Here's a fringe fact to tuck under your pillow. Some medieval folks believe certain foods went off because of bad stars. Literally, celestial alignments were thought to spoil meat. Blame the moon, not the maggots. Speaking of which, let's discuss those. Maggots, weevils, grain beetles, all frequent guests in the medieval pantry. You bite into a crust of bread and notice something move. Protein, right? Peasants often sifted flour through muslin, not to refine it, but to filter out the bugs. Though, truth be told, some just baked them in for extra crunch. If you're lucky, your loaf's only sin is a tiny wormhole or two. If not, well, enjoy the wiggly surprise. Your host tonight proudly offers you a boiled egg. It smells fine, but when you crack it open, the yolk is green. Maybe it's just overcooked. Or maybe it sat out for a month in the sun. Are you going to risk it? Of course you are. You're hungry. Stomach cramps were a regular part of life. Everyone had bad guts at some point. The polite term was a flux. The not-so-polite version? Explosive, noisy, and extremely public. But here's the twist. Medieval people weren't stupid. They knew food could be dangerous, and they developed rituals to protect themselves. Some folks whispered charms before drinking milk. Others hung herbs above pantry doors to ward off rot. Recipes sometimes included ingredients like blessed salt or holy water. It wasn't magic. It was hope. In towns, food inspectors did exist. Not many and not consistent, but guilds often set standards. Bakers who cheated on loaf weight could be punished. Fishmongers selling spoiled eels might be dunked in the river, publicly, with jeers. Still, enforcement varied wildly. In a bad season, almost anything could end up on your plate. You might spot a stew bubbling in a corner. You ask what's in it. The cook shrugs. Meat. That's never a good sign. And if the food itself didn't get you, the cookware might. Many pots were lead glazed. Attractive? Sure. Toxic? Absolutely. Acidic food like vinegar or wine could leach lead into your meal faster than you could say, "What's wrong with my kidneys?" You sip some cider from a pewter cup. It tastes metallic. Is that just the cup? Or a sign that you should start writing your will? By now, the night feels heavier. Like your stomach. You lean against the wall, watching rats scurry through kitchen scraps. They thrive here. Thrive like kings. There's a reason the Black Death spread so easily. Food storage was just as porous as the roofs, and the fleas were always invited. You remember that salted pork from earlier? Turns out the salt wasn't just for preservation. It was to mask the beginning of decay. You take another bite, this time more cautious. It's hard, fibrous, like chewing leather soaked in fear. You chew anyway, because in the medieval world, you ate what was there, not what was safe, not what was tasty, just what existed. Still, people adapted. They built immune systems tougher than oxhide. Children learned early which mushrooms were safe, which berries spelled doom, and which puddles made you hallucinate medieval mermaids. You learned the hard way, but you learned. So tonight, as your belly rumbles and your head swims slightly from questionable cider, you lie back and think. You've survived another meal. For now, and in a world where the next bite could be your last. That's worth savoring. You wake up to the tolling of church bells and the scent of something burnt. Again, breakfast in the medieval world isn't a joyride of pancakes and fresh fruit. It's more of a reluctant negotiation between your stomach and what hasn't spoiled overnight. Today's first offering, yesterday's porridge, reheated over embers, with a crust like roof tar. It's gray, it's lumpy, and yes, it's your best option. You take a bite and try to ignore the faint taste of smoke, ash, and possibly rat hair. Here's the truth. Medieval people rarely ate breakfast as we understand it. Breaking the fast often happened later in the morning and wasn't considered essential. Many peasants went straight to work before eating anything at all. For monks, it was regulated down to the hour. No food until the day's first prayers were complete. Suffering on an empty stomach was a kind of spiritual flex. But the elite? Oh, they had breakfast when it suited them. Cold meat, bread, wine, maybe a sweetened pudding if the cook was ambitious. Not because it was healthy, but because they could. Historians still argue whether medieval breakfasts were widespread or just pockets of privilege. Either way, no one was flipping omelets or sipping cappuccinos. You glance at your host table. A hunk of bread, some goat cheese, a jug of ale. That's it. And honestly, it's not bad. The bread is coarse but hearty, the cheese a little sharp, and the ale mild enough to pass for funky apple juice. You eat in silence, listening to chickens squawk somewhere behind the house. But now it's midday, the real eating hour. The main meal of the day, called dinner, yes, dinner at noon, was serious business. For peasants, it often meant a thick pottage, a vegetable stew bulked out with barley, peas, or beans. Meat was rare, but if you had it, celebration time. You might see bacon bits or the occasional rabbit that just wandered too close to the trap. Father, I swear. Still, there were rules. During fast days, which covered roughly half a calendar year, meat was banned. Fish was a loophole. And yes, eels count. So do beavers, apparently, at least their tails, which some monks argue were fish-like. Fringe theology at its tastiest. So let's talk about fish. Inland? Tough luck. You had salted cod so stiff it needed soaking for days. Coastal towns fared better. But fish markets were chaotic. You walk past one now. Gutters flowing with scales and blood, gulls fighting like drunk pirates, vendors shouting over piles of slippery silver. You can't tell if that smell is the fish or the last fishmonger who lost a toe to frostbite. Cooking fish was tricky. Overboiled? Mushy. Undercooked? Parasites. Medieval cooks often fried it in oil, especially on religious holidays. Speaking of which, they took fasting seriously. Not eating meat didn't mean starving. In fact, on wealthy monastic fast days, monks might enjoy 3 different types of fish: cheese custards, sweet pastries, and almond milk stews. The Lord's work, done luxuriously. Meanwhile, peasants made do. Maybe a handful of dried peas, some onions, wild greens foraged from a nearby field. Everything went into the pottage. It boiled and bubbled endlessly, added to each day, growing murkier by the hour. Some families joked it never truly finished. It just changed forms, like edible lava. And yes, it sometimes included bits of stale bread, sour beer, or a suspicious-looking carrot that might actually be a parsnip, or a turnip, or a rock. You'll find out when you bite it. There were little joys. Herbs, for instance. You tear some sage and toss it into the pot. The aroma lifts, subtle but real. Medieval gardens were full of healing herbs. Rosemary for remembrance, mint for digestion, thyme for, well, thyme's just cool. These added brightness to otherwise heavy meals. Occasionally, you'd get frumenty, a sweet grain pudding cooked with milk, eggs, or broth. It straddled the line between dessert and dinner, and was often eaten during holidays. You taste a spoonful. It's like warm rice pudding's earthier, slightly confused cousin. But now it's late afternoon, and things are winding down. Supper, the smaller evening meal, is approaching, not because people aren't hungry, but because fuel is precious, and lighting after dark is risky. Fires are banked low. Meals shrink. You might get leftover stew, a crust of bread dipped in broth, maybe a boiled egg if you're lucky, or a raw onion, which you eat like an apple, because fiber is medieval fun. Here's a weird fact to nibble on while you chew. Some peasants brought their own spoons to dinner parties. Cutlery wasn't provided. Forget forks. They weren't common in most of Europe until the late Middle Ages. And even then, they were eyed suspiciously. Asterisk two-pronged, like the devil's own tool? No thank you. Asterisk. So it's fingers and knives. You cut your bread with your own small blade. Wipe your hands on your tunic. And do your best not to sneeze into the communal bowl. By nightfall, your belly feels full in a way only barley and beets can make it. You've eaten enough to survive another day. Maybe even find a small flicker of satisfaction in the garlic-scented air. But here's the kicker. Despite the drudgery, many medieval folks saw food as something sacred. A gift, a blessing. Meals were slow, shared, talked over. Hunger made everything sharper. Even the blandest broth could taste like victory after a long day in the fields. You sip the last of your weak ale, lean back against a beam and close your eyes. Another day of surviving the table, not just the sword. And in this world, that's something. The fire crackles low beside you, and your thoughts drift to something both familiar and strangely distant. Flavor. Real flavor. The kind that dances across your tongue and tells stories of spice routes and sun-drenched fields. But in medieval Europe, flavor wasn't just a matter of taste. It was about class, trade, medicine, and sometimes outright deception. You stir a small pot of broth. Try to coax something more out of it. Maybe you toss in a clove of garlic, a pinch of dried parsley. It's better. Still, it's a far cry from the spice-laced feast you've heard of in castles and courts. Welcome to the medieval taste divide, with a rich dine in dazzling color, and the poor mostly gnawed on beige. Let's talk spices. In elite kitchens, they were currency. Literally. Pepper was so prized it was used in rent payments and dowries. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, mace, these weren't just flavor boosters. They were power moves. To serve meat dusted with exotic spice was to whisper, I can afford to taste the world. You walk past the manor kitchens now. Rich smells waft out. Roast fowl with saffron glaze, mulled wine spiked with clove, venison swimming in cinnamon-heavy sauces. It's not subtle. It's performative. And sometimes weird. Historians still argue whether noble palates genuinely enjoyed these spicy, sweet-sour combos or just played along to show off. Sugar and stew? Absolutely. Gold leaf on fish? If you've got it, flaunt it. But here's the rub. These ingredients didn't come easy. Spices travel from Asia through complex trade networks, passing through Arabic merchants, Venetian ports, and countless tolls. By the time they hit a European table, the markup could be absurd. A sack of pepper might be worth a sheep. A dash of saffron, enough to buy your family dinner for a week, if you weren't grinding it into a duck sauce instead. Still, not everything was exotic. Many people relied on local flavorings. Mustard seeds were ground into pungent pastes. Horseradish cleared sinuses with medieval ferocity. Vinegar added a zing to tired greens, and onions were practically a food group. And then there was salt, not a seasoning, but a necessity. It preserved meat, fermented vegetables, and made bland grain porridge marginally less sad. Some towns, like those near the great salt pans of France or Germany, grew rich on its trade. But for most, salt was carefully rationed. That chunk you just dropped in pot, that's tomorrow's seasoning too. Fringe fact, there were actual color rules in cooking. Medieval cooks often colored dishes with natural dyes. Saffron for yellow, spinach for green, ground almond for white, and powdered charcoal for black. These weren't just for show. They aligned with humoral theory, the dominant medieval health philosophy that claimed your body's balance of fluids influenced everything from mood to digestion. Red foods were hot and dry, ideal for sluggish temperaments. Blue foods? Well, good luck finding those. You spoon some of your soup and wish for just a pinch of pepper. But even when spices were available, their quality varied wildly. Ground spices were easily faked. Unscrupulous sellers cut cinnamon with bark, patted pepper with crushed seeds, or dyed turmeric to make it more golden. Food fraud was real, and guilds were constantly trying to police it. But without modern labs, good luck proving your ginger isn't just colored sawdust. Some cooks found ways around the problem. You visit a modest kitchen now, where a clever woman is mixing dried lavender, marjoram, and rosemary into a paste for a roast rabbit. It smells divine, sweet, woodsy, floral. No cinnamon? No problem. Local herbs could mimic the aroma, even if they couldn't quite replicate the prestige. And for peasants, flavor was less about exact ingredients and more about creativity. Medieval cookbooks, when they existed, read more like poetry than instruction. Take good meat, boil it well, and season with what you have. Not exactly precise. Recipes varied wildly by region, wealth, and what was left in the pantry. You were expected to taste, adjust, and improvise. And that's where flavor becomes survival. Imagine boiling the same barley gruel for the 10th day in a row. If you had a little dried sage, a miracle. A bit of leeks? Culinary bliss. That time you stumbled upon a patch of wild thyme in the woods? A life-altering memory. Still, certain flavors were reserved for the church or the rich. Almond milk, for example. A luxury you'd think wouldn't exist before blenders and shelf-stable cartons, but was hugely popular, especially during meatless fasts. Ground almonds, soaked and squeezed, made a creamy substitute for milk and butter. It found its way into everything from sauces to pastries to religious fasting soups. You take a sip from a wooden cup filled with mock milk. It's warm, slightly gritty, and tastes like crushed ambition with a splash of effort. Not unpleasant, but not quite dairy either. You overhear an apothecary explaining that spices also have healing properties. Ginger for stomach troubles, clove for toothache, cinnamon for circulation. Whether they worked or not, up for debate. But they were often added to food not for taste, but for medicine. A chicken stew might be seasoned with sage not just for flavor, but because someone in the house had a cough. Flavor and function blurred. Your feast might double as your pharmacy, which makes you eye that bowl of nettle soup a little more respectfully. Here's a fringe one for the road. Certain medieval cooks believed spices could mask not only spoilage, but sin. Food too luxurious might corrupt the soul, but if it had enough hot spices, maybe it purged the excess. So in theory, your pepper stuffed duck might be both an indulgence and a confession. Night deepens, and your stomach is tentatively content. You've eaten something more than just survival. You've tasted intention. Maybe not luxury, maybe not spice routes, but care. And in a time when flavor was rare, that meant everything. You blow out the lantern and let your tongue remember the last hint of rosemary. It's not cinnamon glazed pheasant, but it'll do. Morning mist clings to the thatched rooftops like wet wool, and your stomach grumbles with troubling regularity. You're starting to understand something important about medieval life. Eating isn't guaranteed, it's a gamble. And when famine strikes, that gamble becomes a daily crisis. Let's set the scene. You're in the year 1315. It's spring, but not the hopeful kind. Rain has fallen for weeks, flooding fields, rotting grain, drowning hope. You slosh through muck to the village granary, only to find it locked and guarded. What little food there is must stretch far. Welcome to the Great Famine. Over the next 2 years, nearly all of Northern Europe would face catastrophic harvest failures. Crops withered in the mud, and seed stock was eaten instead of sown. Livestock starved. Fish disappeared from rivers. Even the wealthy felt it, though not quite like the peasants. You, friend, are the peasant. And tonight's dinner is boiled bark and wishful thinking. You try to forage. Nettles, dandelions, sourdock, any green thing that won't poison you. But even weeds are in short supply. Some families dig up roots so bitter they have to be boiled 3 times just to become edible. Hunger makes everything negotiable. Quirky tidbit. Some folks resort to eating moss and thatch. Seriously, the National Library of Sweden holds accounts of starving villagers peeling the moss off old roofs to boil like cabbage. It didn't work, nutritionally speaking, but it filled the belly just enough to sleep. Meanwhile, desperation leads to darker things. Historians still argue whether tales of cannibalism in remote regions are fact or famine folklore, though enough medieval chronicles whisper about it to make you squirm. One story tells of a woman caught baking human bones into bread. Is it truth? Exaggeration? In the chaos of hunger, the line blurs. Social order starts to unravel. The baker down the road, once known for his rye loaves, is found hoarding grain in his cellar. Villagers storm the shop. He begs for mercy, swearing he was saving it for the sick. No one believes him. He vanishes that night. The church offers little comfort. Prayers are held daily. Bells toll in mourning. But the rain keeps falling, and the bread keeps shrinking. Some claim it's divine punishment. Too much sin, too little repentance. Others say it's the devil's doing. Either way, you're still hungry. Let's talk about bread. In normal times, it's the cornerstone of every meal. But during famine, even bad bread is a luxury. Bakers start bulking their dough with ground peas, beans, acorns, and even sawdust. This famine bread is dense, dark, and hard to digest. It cracks when you bite it, and it cracks something inside you, too. Still, it's better than nothing. You manage to trade your last spoon for a crust the size of your palm. It's sour, probably from spoiled flour, but it brings tears to your eyes. You eat it slowly, chewing each bite like a memory. But hunger makes people inventive. One villager constructs a trap using string and a snare for crows. Another digs a pit, hoping to catch rabbits. A young girl sells tiny bundles of wilted greens in exchange for candle stubs. When calories are currency, desperation becomes a daily marketplace. The psychological toll is real. Children stop crying. That's always the worst sign. You see fewer fires at night, fewer smells of cooking. People hide what they have. Trust dissolves. Suspicion sharpens. Now, a quick comparison. A wealthy manor might survive the famine, but not without compromise. Salted meats run low. Imported spices disappear. Even they start bulking stews with barley husks. But unlike you, they have cellars. They have storage. And sometimes they have guards. Some towns attempt rationing. Others rely on charity. Monasteries open their doors until they, too, run dry. You line up for a ladle of thin broth. It's mostly water, floating with the ghost of a vegetable. But it's warm, and it's shared. Fringe solution? Animals not usually considered livestock suddenly become meals. Hedgehogs, dogs, cats. There's even a record of people boiling leather shoes. You eye your boots nervously. Still, there are moments of kindness. A stranger shares half a turnip. A miller grinds grain for free until the Lord demands a share. A traveling priest sings hymns while handing out wafers. He says it's not real bread, but it's real enough for today. Historians agree that the Great Famine marked more than just agricultural failure. It revealed how fragile the food web truly was. No refrigerated storage, no mass distribution. If the local field failed, the table failed with it. You rest beneath a tree, stomach hollow, brain spinning. Hunger does that. It makes the world echo. But you remember an elder's words. All storms pass, even the ones that come through your ribs. Eventually, in late 1317, the rains ease. The sun returns. Fields dry. But famine's fingerprints remain. Graves are fuller. eyes are hollower. And bread? Bread tastes different now. Every crumb is a gift. You walk back to the village, where smoke rises from a rekindled hearth. A pot simmers. Not much, but enough. Turnips, beans, a carrot or two. A meal. And in this world, that's a feast. You wake up to the smell of something different. Smoky, sour, with a hint of panic. It's fish of the dried, salted, rehydrated variety. Someone's trying their best. But the scent reminds you that in medieval times, food wasn't just eaten, it was obeyed. Welcome to the world of feast and fast. The church had its teeth deep in the medieval diet. And while it didn't monitor your seasoning choices, though one suspect say frown at too much saffron, it did control your calendar. Nearly half the year was spent in fasting, mandatory abstinence from meat, dairy, and sometimes even eggs. That's right, about 150 to 180 days annually, depending on the region. Lent, Advent, Ember Days, Vigils, and every single Friday, say goodbye to bacon. You trudge into the kitchen where today's fast day special waits. Dried herring soaked overnight and boiled into something vaguely fish-shaped. The cook shrugs. It's what we have. And indeed it is. On fast days, fish was a protein of choice, especially in wealthier homes. Salt cod, pickled herring, smoked eel, all in heavy rotation. Peasants, however, made do with beans, onions, and whatever pond creature didn't move too fast. Here's the fun twist. The rules didn't stop people from getting clever. Wealthy households, ever fond of loopholes, turned fasting into performance art. Mock dishes became popular. Imitation roast made from fish sculpted to look like meat. Picture a roast pig made from pressed pike, dyed with beetroot and garnished with almond fat. All the flair of indulgence, none of the forbidden ingredients. Historians still argue whether these dishes truly upheld the spirit of fasting or simply showed off culinary arrogance. Of course, monasteries led the charge. Monks meticulously recorded meals in kitchen logs. Tuesday, lentils and leeks. Wednesday, boiled carp and parsnip mash. Their fish ponds were well stocked, and some monks developed refined tastes. In one record, a French abbot complains his eel was overcooked. Austerity with standards. You pass a table where a boy is chewing a crust dipped in almond milk. No butter allowed, but almond milk? Fair game. In fact, it became a medieval fast staple, used in everything from stews to pastries. Some even use it to make butter and cheese. You try a spoonful. It's creamy, slightly gritty, and tastes like someone tried. For effort. Meanwhile, peasants without access to fish or almonds just got hungrier. Their fast meals often consisted of pottage, boiled grains with leeks or herbs. Thin, repetitive, and spiritually sobering. One fringe recipe? Watered beer porridge. Yes, they drank their dinner sometimes. Warm ale boiled with oats. It filled the belly and numbed the sense of injustice, if only briefly. But feasting? Ah, now that's where medieval imagination went wild. Feast days often followed fast, and the sudden shift could be dramatic. Picture roasted boar with apples in its mouth, enormous pies hiding live birds. That's not a nursery rhyme. It actually happened. And towers of glazed meat stacked like edible monuments. Royal courts were infamous for excess. A single feast might include swan and pepper sauce, spiced porpoise. Yes, really? And entire castles made of sugar paste. You once saw a pie open to release a band of musicians. Tiny ones, slightly dizzy from being inside pastry for 2 hours. Humor was part of the spectacle. Quirky tidbit. Some feasts had themes. Feast of the Peacock featured peacock meat, redressed in its own feathers to appear alive. Others centered on biblical events, with courses named after saints or sins. One French banquet had a course of hell, with black bread, charcoal soup, and meat dyed with squid ink. It was followed, of course, by the heavenly dessert of gold leaf almond cakes. But not everyone was impressed. A few church reformers criticized such displays. Why build a jelly tower when the poor eat stones? One monk wrote. Of course, no one at court read that. They were too busy debating whether roast crane paired better with cherry glaze or quince syrup. Feasts weren't just food, they were theater and political tools. Hosting a lavish banquet sent a message. I'm rich, powerful, and yes, I can afford 14 courses on a Tuesday. Meanwhile, peasants might feast once or twice a year, at weddings, harvest festivals, or saints' days. Those meals were simple but joyful. Roasted root vegetables, bread, maybe a chicken if someone was feeling generous. And mead, always mead. You wander into a village hall during such a festival. The mood is light. A fiddler plays in the corner. Bread is passed with warm butter. Today's not a fast day. Hallelujah. A pot of lentil stew bubbles over the hearth. It smells earthy, comforting, and a little smoky. You're invited to sit. You do. Historians still debate whether fast days were truly followed by the masses or mostly ignored in private. Some peasants, facing constant hunger, probably didn't notice a line between fasting and famine. But for the church, it was less about personal piety and more about demonstrating control over everyday life, including your stomach. And that control, it lingered. Recipes were shaped by it. Menus planned around it. Even language absorbed it. Words like fish day or fleshless entered everyday use. And just imagine your weekly meal plan being dictated not by mood, but by whether St. Eustace had died that month. Now, as the village feast winds down, you taste a final bite of honeyed oat cake. It's sweet, simple, and for once not boiled. You smile. Not every meal here is punishment. Sometimes, even in a world of rules and rain, flavor sneaks in. You wake to the unmistakable stink of vinegar and raw onions. No one's pickling for pleasure. They're trying to survive. Today, you enter the gritty realm of medieval food preservation, where the real miracle isn't how long the food lasts, but that anyone dared to eat it afterward. First, forget refrigeration. Not even a hopeful breeze in that department. Preservation was about staying one step ahead of decay, and that meant salt, smoke, vinegar, honey, drying, or burying things underground like some desperate culinary time capsule. You pull open a wooden storage cask and wince. It's pork, salted so heavily it feels like licking a stone. Still, you scrape off the top layer, soak it overnight, and hope for the best. Salt is the undisputed king of medieval preservation. Fish, meat, even vegetables, packed and layered in it until they're more mineral than meal. But salt wasn't cheap. Inland villages sometimes used it sparingly, which meant only nobles or monasteries could afford a salt on an industrial scale. You, dear peasant, likely only saw such meat during feast days or funerals. And even then it was chewy. For the rest of us, smoking. You walk past a smokehouse and cough involuntarily. Thick clouds of oak, beech, or sometimes peat rising from damp logs. Eels dangle from hooks, curling like charred ribbons. Smoked hams swing on iron rods, greasy and dark. It smells like someone set fire to a pantry, then decided that was a good idea. Still, smoked meat's kept for weeks, even months, if wrapped in cloth and hung in cool, dry places. Then there's drying. Grains and legumes were sun-dried when possible, and fruits like apples or plums were sliced in and left on racks to toughen. You nibble on a dried pear chip. It tastes like sweetened leather, but it's better than the alternative, rot. Vinegar played a key role, too. Pickled onions, pickled beets, pickled everything. Not for taste. Let's be clear, but for survival. One fringe recipe from 14th century Poland preserved cucumbers by soaking them in beer vinegar, garlic, and horseradish. then sealing the crock with pig fat. Historians still argue whether this actually extended shelf life or just discouraged people from opening the jar. You approach a row of earthenware jars in a cellar, each sealed with wax. Inside, potted meats, a technique involving cooking meat in fat and sealing it beneath a layer of lard. It's the medieval version of a meat candle, and yes, it actually worked. You scoop a fingerful from a pot labeled goose. It's salty, fatty, and oddly tasty, assuming you ignore the grayish hue. Now, honey, sweet, sticky, antibacterial gold. A natural preservative. Honey was often used to coat fruit or to candy ginger and nuts. Wealthy kitchens even submerged tiny birds, like sparrows, in honey jars. You pass one such jar now. Its contents murky, the silhouette of some unfortunate bird visible beneath the surface. You decide to skip that snack. Cellaring was also key. Below ground, temperatures held steady. Root vegetables lasted months in straw-lined bins. Apples were wrapped in cloth and spaced apart like sleeping monks. Cabbages hung from beams, looking like leafy chandeliers. The smell was complicated. Of course, not everything preserved well. Milk, for instance, turned on you faster than a gossiping neighbor. But clever minds turned milk into cheese and butter. Hard cheeses aged well. Some so tough you needed a knife just to bite them. You try a sliver of medieval cheddar. It's sharp, crumbly, and tastes like it could survive a siege. Quirky tidbit, in parts of Scandinavia, fish was preserved using lye to create lutefisk, a gelatinous dish so pungent it doubles as a security system. You heard rumors that it was once banned from a village feast because it kept causing accidents. One priest reportedly slipped on a stray piece and broke his ankle. That's not dinner. It's a hazard. Back in your village, you join a group preparing to preserve their annual meat haul. A pig's been slaughtered, and nothing goes to waste. The fat is rendered, the intestines washed for sausage casing, the blood saved for pudding. It's a messy business, but it's how winter is survived. You help string up some sausages near the hearth to dry. They're plump, speckled with barley, and seasoned with whatever was available, garlic, maybe sage. If these dry properly, they'll feed your household for weeks. If not, they'll attract flies and go sour. No pressure. Of course, not every experiment worked. Some attempt at preservation resulted in food that technically lasted, but made people sick. One infamous case involved spoiled rye flour baked into bread. The ergot fungus on the grain caused hallucinations, seizures, and what's called dancing plague. Entire villages struck with convulsions and visions after eating tainted loaves. Historians still debate whether this ergotism caused the bizarre outbreaks or if mass hysteria played a part. You sit by the fire now, a pot of preserved lentils bubbling gently. The air is thick with smoke and spice. Someone passes a slab of dried beef. It's tough but edible, and that, in medieval times, is a win. There's something sobering about how much work went into just keeping food, not preparing it, not enjoying it, simply making sure it didn't rot before you could eat it. A loaf of bread was a promise and a countdown. A smoked ham was a trophy and a time bomb. So, next time you open your fridge, marvel at the cool air and soft light. Because once upon a time, you needed salt, soot, vinegar, wax, and luck just to make it to the next meal. And even then, you might have wished the meat hadn't survived. You wake one final time in this medieval world, nose wrinkling at something acrid wafting through the air. Not vinegar, not rotting meat, just the unmistakable stench of desperation. Welcome to the hardest meals of all, famine food. Let's be clear, food sucked in medieval times most of the time, but during famines, it stopped pretending. Crops failed, stores ran dry, and what ended up on the table, if anything, could only loosely be called food. Famine was terrifyingly common. Bad weather, war, disease, or a poor harvest could throw an entire region into chaos. You glance outside. Fields flooded from an early frost. The barley? Gone. Rye? Molded. Cabbages? Eaten by goats that later dropped dead. You get the picture. With the pantry reduced to a broom and hope, you join the village in its grim fallback rituals. Bark is scraped from trees. Not the outer layer, mind you, but the inner cambium. Dry, ground, and mixed with a little barley flour, it becomes famine bread, dark, fibrous, almost entirely inedible. You take a bite. It tastes like wet bandages and bitterness, but it keeps you alive. Kind of. Fringe tidbit? Some Scandinavian villages made soup from moss boiled with fish bones. It created a kind of gelatinous goo, a moss pudding, that filled the belly if not the soul. One 14th century monk described it as slimy, green, and humbling. He wasn't wrong. You pull up a chair beside an old woman boiling a pot of pot herbs. That's medieval for whatever grows in ditches. Nettles, dock leaves, sorrel, wild garlic. Anything vaguely leafy that doesn't immediately kill you. The stew smells sharp, earthy, and slightly medicinal. It's not the worst. Children gnaw on acorns that have been soaked to remove the tannins. Their faces twist at the bitterness anyway. You remember that squirrels bury acorns for later. Maybe they're onto something. As hunger deepens, desperation sets in. Rats become viable protein. Birds are caught with nets. Feathers plucked hastily, meat stringy and tough. Dogs disappear. Horses, if not already requisitioned for war, are slaughtered for food. In one Parisian account from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, people reportedly dug up buried grain from graveyards. Historians still argue whether these stories of cannibalism, children stolen from cradles, bodies exhumed for meat, are exaggerated or tragically true. But famine-era chronicles don't hold back. They describe neighbors turning on one another, families fleeing cities, even entire villages vanishing from maps. Whatever truth they contain, they speak of a time when food was no longer sustenance, but salvation. And yet, even in these bleakest years, creativity flickered. A mother stretches a pot of gruel with a pinch of leftover pea flour. Someone tries roasting thistle roots. A monk experiments with making broth from hay. Yes, hay. The result is predictably grim, but still, the attempt matters. You find a hovel where a woman is cooking something in a blackened cauldron. It's made from boiled animal hides, softened into jelly. A grim delicacy from famine lore. She offers a spoonful. You decline, heart-sinking. Eventually, if you're lucky, the seasons shift. A faint green returns to the fields. Wild garlic pokes through frost. A lamb is born and not immediately eaten. There's relief, but not joy. Too many are missing from the table. Too many never made it through the bark bread and moss stew. One village priest keeps a tally. His ledger shows a pattern. Famine, then plague, then a lull, then famine again. It's not cyclical. It's chaos with a rhythm. And that rhythm beats through every food memory, every boiled root, every burnt crust scraped from an oven floor. You sit quietly now beside an old man. He breaks a chunk of barley bread in half and hands it to you. It's dry, dense, but real, a sign that you survived. For now. So why did food suck so much in medieval times? Because it wasn't just food. It was politics, piety, weather, war, superstition, scarcity, rot, hope, and heartbreak, all squeezed into a pot that never quite boiled over. Meals weren't moments. They were gambles. Every mouthful was a victory over time, decay, or nature itself. And the taste? Often irrelevant. You lean back. The air smells faintly of lentils and wood smoke. A dog barks somewhere far off. Someone's baking oatcakes with a hint of honey. Maybe tonight, you won't dream of bark soup or salted misery. Maybe, for just one moment, you're full. Now, take a deep breath. You wander through crumbling kitchens and damp cellars, tiptoed past moldy loaves and mystery stews. You've chewed bark, sniffed dried eel, and survived more dubious dinners than most people manage in a lifetime. And somehow you're still here. Sort of. There's something oddly comforting in knowing that the human spirit can endure anything, even centuries of bad cooking. That peasants, monks, and queens alike once stared into empty pots. Try and conjure something. Anything worth eating. That flavor was a luxury. But eating together, surviving together, that was the true feast. As the last embers fade beneath the cauldron, the village grows quiet. Distant wind rattles shutters. A cradle creaks gently. The smell of old onions drifts away, replaced by silence. You rest your head on a straw-stuffed pillow, belly full, or at least no longer aching. The memory of ash-tasting bread and sour ale slips away like mist. The fire flickers low, casting golden halos across the stone walls. And for just a moment, you imagine a warm bowl of soup that isn't gray, a piece of bread that doesn't crack your tooth, a world where the pantry doesn't whisper threats. Let that thought carry you now, soft and slow, into sleep. Tomorrow will come, and maybe with it, a better harvest, or at least a slightly less offensive breakfast. Good night.